The date is August 6, 1945. In a factory in rural Tennessee, a young woman named Ruth is sitting on a high stool in front of a massive steel control panel. She has been sitting there for 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 2 years. Her job is simple but monotonous. She watches a needle on a gauge. If the needle drifts to the left, she turns a knob to the right. If it drifts to the right, she turns the knob to the left. She has to keep the needle centered. She does not know what the machine does. She does not know what the knob controls. She does not know what the building she is sitting in is for. She only knows that if she asks questions, she will be fired and evicted from her home within 24 hours. She is one of thousands of young women doing the exact same thing in a building so large that it has its own weather system. Then the announcement comes over the public address system. The voice of the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, crackles through the speakers. He announces that an American airplane has dropped a new type of weapon on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. He calls it an atomic bomb. Ruth looks at the knob in her hand. She looks at the gauge. And for the first time, she realizes what she has been doing. She wasn't just turning a dial. She was enriching uranium. She was building the weapon that just ended a city. Ruth didn't live in a normal town. She lived in a place that, according to every map printed in 1944, did not exist. It was a phantom metropolis. It consumed 1/7 of all the electricity produced in the United States. It had a population of 75,000 people, bigger than countless state capitals. It had a bus system that carried more passengers than the city of Baltimore. It had schools, theaters, and bowling alleys. But it had no name. It was surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by machine gun towers. To the outside world, it was just a blank spot in the Appalachian Mountains. To the government, it was Site X. Today, we know it as Oak Ridge, Tennessee. This is the story of the greatest construction project in the history of the human race. It is the story of how the United States government built a fake city from scratch in the middle of the wilderness to manufacture a substance that had never existed on Earth in visible quantities. But the question remains, how? How do you hide a city of 75,000 people? How do you build a factory to produce a product that even the world's smartest scientists aren't sure is possible? And how do you convince an army of workers to keep a secret that could destroy the world? To understand the existence of the secret city, we have to go back to a letter written in 1939. It was signed by Albert Einstein, but it was written by the Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard. It was addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The letter contained a terrifying warning. German physicists had discovered nuclear fission. They had figured out that if you split a uranium atom, it releases energy. If you could chain those reactions together, you could build a bomb of unimaginable power.
The letter warned that Nazi Germany had stopped the sale of uranium from the Czechoslovakian mines they had captured. This was a signal. Hitler was building a bomb. Roosevelt acted. He authorized the Manhattan Project, a crash program to beat the Nazis to the weapon. But the project immediately hit a wall of physics. Uranium, as it comes out of the ground, is mostly a stable isotope called uranium-238. It is useless for a bomb. The explosive part is an isotope called uranium-235. But U-235 is incredibly rare. For every 1,000 atoms of uranium you dig up, only 7 are the explosive U-235. And here was the nightmare. U-235 and U-238 are chemically identical. You cannot separate them with acid or heat. The only difference between them is weight. U-235 is slightly, microscopically lighter. To build a bomb, the Allies needed to separate these two isotopes on an industrial scale. They needed to filter atoms based on a weight difference of less than 1%. The scientists calculated that to separate enough U-235 for a single bomb would require a factory miles long, thousands of miles of piping and more electricity than a major city. The scientists said it would take 10 years. The Army said they had 2. To achieve the impossible, the Army turned to a man who treated the impossible as a personal insult. His name was General Leslie Groves. Groves was not a physicist. He was a builder. He had just finished building the Pentagon in record time. He was abrasive, arrogant, and hated by many of the scientists, but he was a force of nature. When he was put in charge of the Manhattan Project, he didn't ask for a laboratory. He asked for a map. He needed a place to build the factories. It had to be isolated, far from the coasts to avoid German or Japanese bombers. It had to have access to massive amounts of water for cooling. And most importantly, it needed electricity, oceans of it. He pointed his finger at a series of ridges and valleys in East Tennessee, about 20 miles west of Knoxville. It was protected by the Clinch River. It was serviced by the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, which had just built massive hydroelectric dams. In September 1942, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers descended on the quiet farming communities of Happy Valley and Scarborough. They didn't knock on doors. They posted eviction notices on trees. Over 3,000 families, many of whom had lived on that land for generations, were given weeks to leave. They were paid pennies on the dollar for their farms. It was a brutal, swift displacement. The farmers watched in confusion as their homes were bulldozed and their cemeteries relocated. They were told it was for the war effort, but they were never told why.
In their place, the Army began to build a city. The speed of construction was biblical. The ground was broken in late 1942. By the middle of 1943, a city was rising from the mud. But it wasn't a normal city. It was a temporary, frantic encampment designed for one purpose: speed. The roads were unpaved rivers of red Tennessee clay. The housing consisted of thousands of cemesto houses, prefabricated structures made of cement and asbestos that could be assembled in hours. They also built hutments, plywood shacks with pot-bellied stoves, and massive dormitories for the single workers. The mud was so bad that workers lost their boots in it. Boardwalks were laid down everywhere. It was a frontier boomtown, but instead of gold miners, it was populated by physicists and construction workers. The city was segregated by security clearance. There was a fence around the whole valley, but there were fences inside the fences. The factories were fortresses. The biggest of these fortresses was the K-25 plant. When K-25 was completed, it was the largest building under one roof in the world. It was a mile-long U-shaped monster covering 44 acres. You could fit the Great Pyramid of Egypt inside its footprint multiple times. Inside this behemoth was the secret mechanism for separating the uranium. It used a process called gaseous diffusion. The uranium was turned into a gas and pumped through miles of porous barriers. The lighter U-235 atoms would float through the barriers slightly faster than the heavier U-238 atoms. But the difference was so slight that the gas had to be pumped through thousands of stages over and over again. The piping inside K-25, if laid end to end, would stretch from New York to Chicago. The pumps required to move this gas were so specialized that no company in America could build them. They had to operate in a vacuum, spinning at supersonic speeds without leaking a single molecule. If air got in, the uranium gas would solidify and ruin the machine. If oil got in, it would explode. General Groves pushed American industry to the breaking point. He contracted Chrysler, Allis-Chalmers, and Kellogg to build the components. But K-25 wasn't the only way. Groves, hedging his bets, built a second factory down the road, U-12. U-12 used a different method called electromagnetic separation. It used massive machines called calutrons. A calutron is essentially a particle accelerator. It uses a massive magnet to bend a beam of uranium ions. The lighter ions bend in a tighter arc than the heavier ones, allowing them to be caught in separate pockets.
The magnets for the calutrons were so huge they required 14,000 tons of copper for the coils. But there was a war on. Copper was needed for shell casings and bullets. The Army didn't have 14,000 tons of copper. So General Groves did something that sounds like the plot of a heist movie. He sent his underling, Colonel Kenneth Nichols, to the U.S. Treasury Department. Nichols met with the Undersecretary of the Treasury, Daniel Bell. He told him, "I need to borrow some silver." Bell asked, "How much?" Nichols said, "About 6,000 tons." Bell was appalled. He famously replied, "Young man, at the Treasury we speak of silver in troy ounces, not tons." But Nichols had a letter signed by the Secretary of War. The Treasury opened its vaults. They took 14,700 tons of silver bullion, worth over $300 million at the time, billions today, and melted it down. They cast the silver into giant bus bars and wound them into coils for the magnets at Y-12. For the rest of the war, the most potent weapons factory on Earth was wired with solid silver. Incredibly, after the war, the silver was dismantled and returned to the Treasury. Less than 0.036% was lost to scrap filings. The accounting was perfect. Now the city had the machines. It needed the people. Groves needed thousands of operators to run the calutrons and the diffusion pumps. The scientists assumed they would need PhD physicists to monitor the delicate equipment, but there weren't enough physicists in the world. So they hired high school graduates. Recruiters scoured the hills of Tennessee and the cities of the South. They were looking for young women. They didn't tell them what the job was. The ad simply said, "War workers needed, good pay, secrecy required." These women, who became known as the Calutron Girls, were brought to Oak Ridge by the busload. They were processed, fingerprinted, and given badges. Their training was bizarre. They were taken to the control panels at Y-12, which looked like the dashboard of a spaceship, rows of dials, switches, and meters.
They were taught a simple algorithm. Watch the needle. Keep it in the sweet spot. If it moves left, turn the knob right. They were told that they were helping to shorten the war. They were told that if they messed up, the boys in France won't get their supplies. But they were never told about uranium. The scientists were skeptical. They thought these hillbilly girls would ruin the billion-dollar machines. They set up a contest. They had a team of PhD scientists run one set of calutrons and a team of high school girls run another. The girls won. It turned out that the scientists couldn't stop tinkering. They were constantly trying to optimize the beam, fiddling with the settings. The girls simply did exactly what they were told. They kept the needle centered. They produced more U-235 than the geniuses. But life in Oak Ridge was not just about work. It was a strange, paranoid existence. Everyone wore a badge. The color of your badge determined where you could go. A blue badge could go here. A red badge could go there. If you didn't have the right badge, you were met by an armed guard. The secrecy was enforced by a culture of silence. Billboards were everywhere. What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here. When you leave here, let it stay here. There were lie detector tests. There were FBI agents undercover in the cafeterias. People were encouraged to spy on their neighbors. If a worker asked too many questions about the pipes or the chemicals, they would simply disappear. They weren't killed, of course. They were fired and escorted to the gate within an hour. One day your roommate was there. The next day his bed was empty. You learned not to ask where he went. Relationships in Oak Ridge were surreal. Men and women fell in love, got married, and lived together for years without ever knowing what the other person did for a living. A husband might be a janitor at K25, and his wife a secretary at Y12, and neither had a clue that they were both working on the same bomb. The word uranium was banned. It was referred to as tuballoy. The process was the product. Despite the mud and the secrecy, Oak Ridge was a vibrant city. The average age was 27. It was a city of young people. They had dances, baseball leagues, and a symphony orchestra. They consumed massive amounts of beer. It was a city living on the edge of the apocalypse, partying to blow off steam. But the work was dangerous. It wasn't just the radiation which was poorly understood. It was the chemicals. The gaseous diffusion process used fluorine gas, which is incredibly corrosive and toxic. A leak could turn your lungs to liquid. There were accidents. People were burned or blinded. But the work never stopped. By 1944, the secret ingredient was trickling in.
The K25 plant enriched the uranium slightly, turning it from 0.7% U-235 to about 1% or 2%. This slightly enriched material was then fed into the calutrons at Y12, which boosted it to weapon-grade levels, around 80% to 90%. The output was pitifully small. After months of running huge machines that consumed enough electricity to power a metropolis, they would scrape out a few grams of powder. It looked like nothing, but it was the most dangerous substance in the universe. In July 1945, the product from Oak Ridge was packed into a lead-lined briefcase. It was driven by an officer in plain clothes to San Francisco, then loaded onto the USS Indianapolis and sailed to the island of Tinian in the Pacific. While Oak Ridge was making the fuel, another secret city, Los Alamos, New Mexico, had designed the engine. Robert Oppenheimer and his team had built the bomb mechanism itself. A third secret city, Hanford, Washington, was producing plutonium, a different element for a different type of bomb. But the bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima, Little Boy, was a uranium bomb. It was fueled entirely by the product of Oak Ridge. Little Boy was a gun-type bomb. It worked by firing a bullet of Oak Ridge uranium into a target of Oak Ridge uranium. When they collided, they reached critical mass. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima. Back in Oak Ridge, the day started like any other. The shifts changed, the buses ran, the Calutron girls sat at their stools and watched the needles. Then came the announcement. When the news broke, the reaction in the secret city was a mixture of jubilation and horror. For years, these people had been living in the mud, working grueling shifts, scrutinized by guards and kept in the dark. They had been told they were winning the war, but they didn't know how. Now they knew. The local newspaper, the Oak Ridge Journal, printed a special edition. The headline was a single word: "It's atomic." People ran into the streets screaming. Car horns honked. The war was going to end. Their sons and husbands in the Pacific wouldn't have to invade Japan.
But as the details of the destruction in Hiroshima came out, the vaporized city, the shadows burned into concrete, the tens of thousands dead in an instant, a different mood settled over the valley. Ruth, the girl at the control panel, realized that the needle she had been watching for 2 years wasn't just a gauge, it was a trigger. Every time she centered that needle, she was collecting the atoms that had just incinerated a city. Some workers had nervous breakdowns. One physicist at the plant reportedly looked at the champagne being passed around and said, "Today we are the heroes. Tomorrow we will be the devils.
The secret city didn't disappear when the war ended. The fences stayed up, the checkpoints remained. Oak Ridge transitioned from making bombs to making science. The K-25 plant continued to run during the Cold War, enriching uranium for the nuclear arsenal that faced off against the Soviet Union. The Y-12 plant is still there today, serving as the Fort Knox of uranium, the primary storage facility for the nation's weapons-grade material. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory became a center for nuclear medicine, discovering isotopes that cure cancer rather than cause destruction. The very technology used to separate death was repurposed to sustain life. But the legacy of 1943 remains. It proved that a nation could mobilize on a scale that defied reality. The United States built a city of 75,000 people in a year. They spent $2 billion, $30 billion in today's money, on a project with no guarantee of success. They built the largest factory on Earth to filter invisible particles. They borrowed the National Treasury silver to build magnets. And they did it all in total silence. It is a feat of logistics, engineering, and secrecy that will likely never be repeated. In the age of satellites and the internet, you cannot hide a city. You cannot hide the heat signature of a uranium plant. You cannot hide the movement of 75,000 people. Oak Ridge was a moment in time where fear and necessity suspended the laws of what was possible. Today, if you visit Oak Ridge, you can still see the guard towers. You can tour the graphite reactor. You can see the shadow of the secret city. It stands as a monument to the terrifying power of science, but also to the sheer force of human will. It reminds us that when civilization is on the line, we are capable of building miracles in the mud. The atomic bomb was not just a triumph of physics, it was a triumph of the Calitron girls, the construction workers, the bus drivers, and the chemical engineers who built a fake city to create a very real end to the greatest war in history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the Manhattan Project, hit that subscribe button. Click here to watch our next video. You don't want to miss it. This is the World War II Archives.